Okay, good morning everybody, welcome back. So today we're gonna discuss a new wave of trade agreements which is called preferential trade agreements, PTAs, that's the abbreviation. And before we go into this, let me just quickly review what we've done so far. We've looked at the multilateral trading system and what the purpose of that multilateral trading system is. That's what we did 2 weeks ago. And that's the multilateral trading system is to some extent an alternative to these PTAs, or the PTAs are an alternative to the multilateral trading system. So we want to explain why we suddenly move from this multilateral system that we set up in 1947 towards this more potentially discriminatory preferential trading system, which includes bilateral trade agreements, so agreements between 2 states or 3 states, and not between all the countries in the international system. So in the introduction, in the first part, I'm going to quickly review the historical background because these preferential trading agreements are nothing new. We've seen them in the history of the international international economic system. We've seen them quite a lot, and we've seen them in different forms. So I talked about some already. I talked already about the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty in the first week, and that treaty was such a preferential trade agreement. I also talked about the imperial preference system when I talked about the interval period. That's again such a preferential trading system, but a very different one. So I'm going to go through the history and then discuss the rise of these preferential trade agreements since the 1990s and what they actually include. And that's important to understand the theories that then later explain the rise of the preferential trading system. And then I'm going to cover 2 explanations why we suddenly see these preferential trading systems. And the first one refers to international politics. So we're going to look at what happened in the international system that can explain this shift from the multilateral system to the preferential trading system. And the second explanation refers to the development strategy of the different countries. So we saw a shift in the development strategies in the 1980s and 1990s that favored the rise of these preferential trade agreements. And the argument here is actually that it's actually not so much about trade. The development argument is it's about locking in economic reform, promoting economic reform, and reducing the amount of political risks that we see in developing countries. So just a quick reminder why we are doing this. We saw this graph already when we talked about the effectiveness of the GATT system. This is from Goldstein and co-authors. That's the study that I discussed extensively, and they estimated the effect of different factors on international trade. So remember, that was bilateral trade, how much one country exports to another. And they said that the GATT system, the multilateral trading system, was really important for promoting trade right after the Second World War, and its importance decreased over time until now. What I haven't discussed so much, but what is really an important result that motivates this week is this other factor, which is the existence of preferential trade agreements. And we see that the effect of preferential trade agreements on trade increases continuously over time. So the bottom line is the effect of the multilateral system on trade decreases while the effect of preferential trade agreements increases over time. So that motivates why our discussion today. So let me give you a quick historical introduction. So in the history of the international economic system, we saw many such regional or preferential trading agreements, and one is, for instance, the Zollverein in Germany, or the German state. So remember that Germany was very split up into different states in the 19th century. And among these states, we saw a trade coalition that started in 1834 And that trading coalition was actually, so that what the states agreed upon was to reduce tariffs on trade within Germany. And this was important, an important step towards the political integration of Germany and German unification in 1871. So this should remind you a bit of the idea of the European Union, where the European Union started as a trading community with the aim to integrate politically further and unify Europe eventually. So that's basically the same idea as we saw already in the 19th century in Germany. And Germany is not unique here. We saw such free trading agreements among Italian states. We saw that among Austrian states, and so on. Now, what's important to remember here that this agreement and the similar agreements at the same time, they were not discriminatory, or at least not much. The intention was not to discriminate against a third party. The idea was to promote trade within this region, not explicitly with the intention to discriminate others. That's different in other agreements. So France established a currency union. So we had a currency area based on the French currency in North and West Africa, which was established in 1901. And it was strengthened in 1928. This was the time when we saw economic competition between European powers. So Germany, Great Britain, France. So they used this currency area, which is a form of a preferential trading agreement, to discriminate against other countries, other great powers. And we saw that also Britain did the same thing. I already talked about the imperial preference system, where Britain started to grant preferential rates, preferential tariffs, so lower tariffs, to members of the Commonwealth countries. And that was system was established in 1932 after the during the Great Depression, again with the intention to discriminate against other great powers, also the United States, but Germany and France. So those agreements are very different. The first one is more trade promoting, and the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty, which also falls into this period in 1860, also is an agreement that has the intention to promote trade. While those two here are trade diverting, they try to redirect trade away from your competitor countries to discriminate them. So that's the historical background that's necessary to understand what the debate is today about the role of preferential trading agreements, whether they're actually discriminatory or whether they're actually trade promoting. And if they're trade promoting, their purpose or their effect on the international system, also on the international multilateral system, is very different than if they are trade diverting. So why do we look at this today? Oh, so what is the legal foundation of those preferential trading systems today? So preferential trading agreements are actually allowed by the GATT system. So Article 14 says the provisions of this agreement, so the GATT agreement, shall not prevent, as between the territories of contracting parties, so the contracting parties are simply the GATT members, the formation of a customs union or of a free trade area, or the adoption of an interim agreement necessary for the formation of a customs union. So there's a legal basis for these PTAs. So they're consistent legally with the multilateral trading system. So that's the first one. So it allows regional integration. Another legal basis is the so-called enabling clause, which was established in the Tokyo Round negotiations in 1979. And the enabling clause is more directed not so much to regions as the first one is, but towards developing countries. So the enabling clause aims at integrating developing countries in the international trading system. It's really called the decision on differential and more favorable treatment, reciprocity, and fuller participation of developing countries. So countries, industrialized countries like Switzerland, can sign a preferential trade agreement with a developing country. Both articles actually require that at the same time you're not increasing the tariffs vis-a-vis third parties. So if Switzerland and Burkina Faso are signing a trade agreement, it means that they cannot increase at the same time tariffs towards other WTO members. After the war, we saw different phases, and that's often called the so-called new regionalism. And this new regionalism started in the 1950s. And what's important to note here is that what we often see as globalization is not really globalization, it's not global. So this increase in trade and this increasing in international economic investment flows and international economic exchange often is not driven by global factors. To some extent, yes, so the GATT system, but much of it is actually regional. So globalization often, what we call globalization often is regionalization. And one example is the European community, the European coal and steel community, which then turned into the European economic communities in the 1950s and 60s. So this is the first wave of regional integration, which happened mostly in Europe. Then in the 1980s, so there was a stagnation of the European Union in the 1970s, but it deepened in the 1980s and 1990s. So in the 1980s, there was a commission that was led by Jacques Delors, who later became the president of the European Commission. And this commission examined why Europe is stagnating economically. And what their solution was that we should further integrate economically. So this led to the Single European Act and later also the Maastricht Treaty in the early 1990s, which established the European monetary integration. We saw in other regions, we saw similar developments. So we saw the North American Free Trade Area, which was established in 1993, and that was preceded by the Canada-United States Free Trade Area. And as you're going to see in a moment, we saw an explosion of bilateral agreements that now go beyond just Europe and just the United States from 1990 onwards. So this is how it looks. This is simply the number of preferential trade agreements that were signed in a particular year. And you see some spikes, some little spikes here. So in the 1960s, that's mostly the European Union. And then again in the 1980s, you saw a lot of agreements. That's again the deepening of the European Union and the North American treaties. And then in 1990, we saw a literal explosion. So in the early 1990s, up to 40 new agreements were signed per year. That slightly declined a bit, but we now have a massive amount of preferential trade agreements. And it actually happens that all countries in the World Trade Organization are members of at least one such preferential trade agreement, except Mongolia. Right? All the other countries have signed such agreements. Now we want to explain that, right? That's not obvious. So why should we, what explains this? Do you have an idea? Why do we see this sudden explosion of preferential trade agreements in 1990? Yes. So the end of the Cold War is a very obvious explanation, and that only has to do with it. So we see the restoration of national sovereignty in Eastern and Central Europe, and they now freely chose to integrate into the world economy, and they did so with preferential trade. So that's to some extent an explanation, but it's not enough. What is the problem here with this explanation? So the problem is that we had this multilateral trading system that was that existed already, and they could simply integrate into the system. They didn't need other forms of integration, right? Other forms, which is the preferential trade agreements. And actually, all these countries did integrate into the World Trade Organization, but at the same time, they also signed the preferential trade agreements, right? So it's not enough as an explanation. I think it's part of it, but it's not a full explanation of what we see here. Now, to understand why we see that, I think it's useful to first look at what kind of agreements we see. And the preferential trade agreements differ massively by what we call depth of integration. And the depth of integration means how much does it actually regulate about international trade and about domestic economic affairs. So we have different forms. The first one is partial economic cooperation or partial trade agreement, where we only have an agreement that covers a few sectors, a few economic sectors. So the European steel and coal and steel community, the starting point of the European integration process, is such a partial economic agreement because it only covers two sectors, steel and coal, right? Now, it later turned into a free trade area, and the free trade area is a set of countries that eliminate all trade barriers among themselves. So that means that you don't have any more tariffs on trade in any product between Germany and France and so on, right? But what they do is they keep different tariffs towards third parties. So Germany would then have a different tariff on imports from the US than France, right? So the NAFTA is such a free trade area. What is the problem of such an arrangement? So you don't have trade barriers within the region, but you have different trade barriers towards third parties, third countries. What would you do as an exporter from a third party, from a third country? Well, what you would do is you send your product to the country with the lowest tariff, right? And then ship it on to the next country where you really want to sell it, but that's a country with a higher tariff, right? So you circumvent, so differential tariffs towards third parties can easily be circumvented. And to avoid that, you need a lot of regulation that clarifies that this is not possible, and you would need to add a certain amount of value to the product in that free trade area, right? A customs union then is a free trade area with a common external tariff. So that's what the European Union does. You have no tariffs within the European Union, and you have a common tariff with all the other countries. A common market then also means that you have free movement of factors. You don't constrain capital flows or workers, the flows of workers. So that's free movement of people, basically. And the next step of integration is a monetary union, as we have it among a few European countries. What's also new is that we don't only have regional trade agreements, but they are now intercontinental, they are bilateral, they are between countries from the north, countries from the south, and between countries from the north and the south, right? So that's a new, those are all new aspects that we haven't seen before. And to give you a sense how this looks like, Here is simply the number of different, so this is the total number of, so these are all, this is a picture that shows you that coded all that relies on data on all the preferential trade agreements that we see in the world. So 340, so that's more than 50% of free trade areas. 170 are partial free trade areas. Very few of them, only 53 are customs unions, and only 9 of them are just about services, trade in services. Most of them are bilateral trade agreements, but we have a few that are between a region and a country. So that's often between the European Union and another country, right? So the European Union has a lot of agreements with neighboring countries, for instance. Many of them, some of them are interregional, but not too many, between 2 regions. But what we see is that most of them are intercontinental. So we see a lot of bilateral agreements between countries from different continents. So what do they cover? Now this is a bit complex, and you can look at it again at home. What this slide shows you, and that's important to understand when we talk about the role of PTAs for development, this slide shows you that it's going way beyond trade, right? These agreements are actually about many other things and not just about tariffs and trade barriers. So the first thing is that they often deal with trade in services. So 285 of these agreements deal with trade in services, which is an aspect that's that's not very well covered by the World Trade Organization. More than 200 of them deal with protection of investments. So investment is actually a financial issue. So if you have money, capital, and you invest it in another country, what these preferential trade agreements specify is that they specify clauses that help to protect the investment of foreign firms. That's related to trade in the sense that these firms want to establish production facilities in these countries and then export their goods, right, back to their home market. So in that sense, it's related to trade, but it's actually more a financial issue. They deal with intellectual property rights. Procurement means how the government spends its money, how it actually gives contracts to firms. That's sanitary provisions and technical barriers to trade. Competition policy, other forms of trade barriers, and then a big deal is dispute settlement. So many of them, almost 500 of these agreements, cover some form of dispute settlement procedure. Now again, that's not directly related to trade. So the point of this slide is to show you that it's actually, these agreements are very deep. So the depth of these agreements is really high. And they go way beyond what the World Trade Organization and the GATT system regulates. They go way beyond just trade. So how do we explain preferential trade or regionalism? Does any theory come up in your mind that you could use for that? From a previous course, is there any theory that you think should be useful to understand this? So the traditional theories are functionalism, and what's the counterpart of functionalism? Do you remember that? Any other idea? Functionalism and intergovernmentalism would be the competitor theory. And those are the ones that could help us to explain why we see this in this increase in preferential trade agreements. So functionalism talks about the demand side. It talks about who wants that. So what does functionalism say? It says that integration is a bottom-up process. It starts by limited economic exchange or limited economic integration, for instance, through some sectors. So we start with a partial preferential trade agreement in coal and steel. And then we see a spillover effect. We see how well it works. And we see how well we can actually benefit from it economically. And then we see spillover into other sectors, right? So who are the drivers? Who are the actors who want that? What actors that benefit from it and who actually promote this process? Well, the main actors are firms and to some extent citizens, to the extent that they work in these firms or benefit from it. So the actors are interest groups who want to have more, who are motivated by reaping more economic gains. And these gains are limited before integration by transaction costs and uncertainty. So which are the transaction costs that are problematic for these firms? What are transaction costs in the first place? So transaction costs means that you have to adapt to different regulatory environments, that you have risk and uncertainty when it comes to exchange rates. They can vary a lot. And those are all obstacles to trade. So you want to avoid that. And that's why you integrate. The supply side is explained by intergovernmentalism. And they have intergovernmentalists have a very different view how integration, regional integration like in Europe happens. So here it's a top-down process where politicians in principle do not want to give up sovereignty. But they do so if they face a big problem and they understand that they can only solve this problem if they work together. So integration now is driven by not by firms, but by national governments who agree to give up sovereignty if it's actually useful for them politically. So the key actors here are governments and policymakers, and their motivation is to solve the issue of the day. They can potentially reap political gains by integration and show political leadership. So to give you just one example, in this story, the EMU, the European Monetary Union, the Eurozone, were not established because it was in the interest of the firms, but because it was a political bargain between the key leaders. So Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, wanted that. That's the story, because he thought that helps best to actually integrate to push the political project, which would help him and Germany politically. So those are the old explanations, which are rooted in theories of European integration. But clearly, they explain some of it, but they cannot explain why we see preferential trade agreements all over the world, right, between continents. So we take that as a starting point, but we're going to focus on other explanations. The economic explanations, for instance, refer to the comparative advantage, different capital-labor ratios, or economies of scales that firms can benefit from if they expand their market. But again, this doesn't explain why we have preferential trade instead of multilateral trading systems. So an international political factor is the stagnation of the WTO. So we haven't talked much about how the WTO actually has stagnated since the mid-1990s. Much of it is, or to some extent, it's driven by geopolitical interests and the desire to be the country that sets the standards in the international economy. And a fourth explanation is how actually one PTA just sets off an automatic mechanism that leads to more PTAs. And if we have more PTAs, then there will be, again, more PTAs automatically, because those parties that are now suddenly being discriminated, they now also want to have them. So I'm going to work through them step by step. And in the second half of this session today, we're going to talk about the purpose of preferential trade agreements to contain political risk, which is important for the development strategies of many countries today. So note that different explanations apply to different preferential trade agreements, right? So the development argument obviously does not apply to preferential trade agreements between Canada and Europe. Here we more see the exporter discrimination, and the standard setting argument is more plausible, right? But if you look at the PTA, if we want to explain the preferential trade agreements between Europe and a developing country, Egypt for instance, then these arguments are obviously more useful. So let's quickly talk about WTO stagnation. And what's important to note here is that the WTO, or the GATT system, and later the WTO obviously, the membership increased massively from 23 members to 100, when it started in 1947, to 163 members today. And we talked about the decision rule in the World Trade Organization, right? And decision making is made by consensus. So first, every country has a vote, has the same weight, and every country can block an agreement. Consensus means that if at least one country disagrees, the new agreement will not pass. But the problem is that with more countries, we have growing heterogeneity in interests. So we have regional associations, so the European Union acts as one actor, but then we have the South American countries, we have the North American countries. We have countries that align by sectoral interests. So some have an interest in agricultural protection, some have an interest in agricultural trade. We have the least developing countries, we have transition countries. All of them have different problems. So all of them have different preferences. And that leads to more and in addition, we are talking about deeper and deeper problems, right? We talk not just about tariffs. At the beginning it was easy. We just wanted to reduce tariffs from 50% to 5% today, right? But now we talk about more and more sectors. We talk about more and more complicated trade restrictions, so non-tariff barriers to trade. Those are the NTBs, or the intellectual property rights, IPRs. And to show you how this then affects the WTO, we can look at the Doha round. So the last round that was concluded was the so-called Uruguay round that was concluded in 1994. And that led to the establishment of the World Trade Organization. But in 2001, a new round was launched, the so-called Doha round. And what we had is already 9 ministerial conferences. And the negotiations essentially collapsed. And they collapsed because we now are discussing agriculture, services, environment, all these things that we excluded before because they were too difficult to agree upon on a global level. And we saw multiple cleavages. So the EU and the US are have a conflict over, for instance, genetically modified food. Then the BRICS countries, the Brazil, Russia, India, and China, they block. So India, for instance, blocked the negotiations as long as the EU and the US would oppose further liberalizations in trade. So we see all these blocks that with very heterogeneous interests. Plus, the BRICS are now fairly powerful, so they cannot just be overruled as it was possible in the past. So that's one explanation. The multilateral system is stagnating, and it's much easier to find common interests between just 2 or 3 countries because we can now sign an agreement between countries with common interests that goes way deeper than what the GATT system currently has. Let me just go one step further and directly get to standard setting. So another argument is that now we move to those what are called the mega regionals. So these are the mega regionals. So this is the CETA is the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement between the EU and Canada, which was just concluded a few years ago. Then we have an effort which is called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which was negotiated between the US and Southeast Asian countries. But what's important to note here is that TPP does not include China, right? Or India. And then we have the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which was negotiated for a long time between the EU and the United States. So the first one is actually being concluded and probably will enter into force, but the second and the third are actually collapsed or Trump said he stopped it. So he ended TPP and he ended the negotiations on TPP and on TTIP. But what's important here is these are mega regional agreements. So mega regionals means between big regions with the aim actually to set the standard in international trade. And that's why China is not included or was not included in the TPP negotiations. And they go fairly deep. They cover all these agreements that we cannot agree upon, all these topics that we cannot agree upon in the World Trade Organizations. And to show you how this actually affects how much this is about competition between major blocs, we have the so-called Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is being negotiated by China and the Southeast Asian countries, but it excludes the United States, right? So China is trying to do exactly the same thing as the United States tried to do with TPP and TTIP. So it covers exactly the same topics, and the motivation is also to set a standard. So giving up TPP might be reasonable if you're critical of trade and ever deeper integration and regulatory harmonization. But at the same time, what's happening in the background is that other countries might take the lead and conclude these agreements, excluding then the EU or the United States. So that's one explanation. So we have an attempt to set standards by different regional and global powers. And so we see a competition that leads to more and more PTAs. Another explanation that's actually more in line with what we've talked about last week, it starts from the same presumptions, is domino theory, which became really popular in the 1990s. And it basically explains how once we just have one agreement, how this leads to a second agreement, and how the second agreement then leads to a third and a fourth and a fifth and so on. So we start from the basic ideas from last week. We have an export-oriented industry, and we have an import-competing industry in a country. And the status quo is protectionism. So we are in a prisoner's dilemma world where we have protectionism because the government wants to please those firms that benefit from protection, which is those who are not competitive, who compete against imports from abroad. And what happens is, assume there's a foreign PTA. A foreign PTA means that you have a trading partner, and that trading partner concluded a preferential trade agreement with another country. That means we see, to some extent, trade diversion away from me. So the exporters in my country, they suffer because they export less to that other country because that other country now trades more with the third country, right? So now this mobilizes exporters. So this foreign preferential trade agreement mobilizes exporters in my country because they also want to have a free trade agreement with that other country because they suffer from it, from this foreign PTA. So this means that a preferential trade agreement between two countries, you and some other country, leads to a trade agreement between me and you and me and that third country in the future, right? Because I want to avoid that I'm going to be discriminated. So now that means that we three now have a preferential trade agreement, so a fourth country is discriminated, right? So that fourth country wants to have a preferential trade agreement with me, with you, and that third country. So now already we started with one preferential trade agreement. That led to two new preferential trade agreements. And those two new preferential trade agreements then lead to three more preferential trade agreements. So that's the domino effect that's happening here. And here's an example. Take Mexico, for instance. So in 1992, Mexico formed the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and the United States. And the Canada and firms in the US and in Canada are direct competitors to firms in Europe, right? They produce the same things. And they now benefit from this free trade agreement and export more to Mexico. And to European firms, they export less. So we see trade diversion that's generated by NAFTA, where the exports from the EU to Mexico dropped by from 11% to 6% between 1993 and 1997. So obviously this mobilizes the export-oriented industry in Europe. And they demand a new free trade agreement, and this is what happened. So Spanish exporters demanded a free trade agreement between the EU and Mexico. And that's exactly what we saw in 2000. The EU concluded a PTA with Mexico in the year 2000. So that's a theory that explains many, many preferential trade agreements pretty well. And it simply relies on the key ideas of our theoretical framework that we discussed last week, right? We have an we have a sectoral model, export-oriented and import-competing industries. And we just add a foreign preferential trade agreement. And we use that model to actually come up with a mechanism that explains the diffusion of preferential trade agreements across the world. So I just want to explain you how we could test this. And this is a paper by Baccini and Dürr, who just test this mechanism. So they use data on diets. We saw diets, right? We saw this data set by Goldstein a few weeks ago. A diet is simply a country pair, so we have the European Union. We treat the EU in trade as one country, and Mexico. So that's one diet. And we take all the countries that we have, and we take the data, we take annual data from 1990 to 2007, right? So to test that domino theory, what would be your dependent variable? Suppose you work for the World Trade Organization again, and then you have a boss who says, I want to know whether domino theory actually works. So test it and tell me the result. So you need to define what the dependent variable is, right? What's the dependent variable when you want to test domino theory? What are we trying to explain today? So we try to explain trade agreement. So the dependent variable is whether we have a trade agreement in this diet, right? Whether in 1990 we have a preferential trade agreement between the EU and Mexico or not. And whether we have one in 1991, 1992, and so on. So that's the dependent variable. What is the independent variable? Yes? So that's still what we have as dependent variable. So we have so that's what we want to explain at the end of the period. But what's true is that the independent variable is the preferential trade agreement that those countries signed with other countries. So the dependent variable here is whether the EU and Mexico have an agreement. And the independent variable is whether Mexico has an agreement with another country and whether the EU has an agreement with another country, right? Domino theory says that if Mexico concludes an agreement with the US, then the EU will conclude an agreement with Mexico, right? So the trade agreement is the dependent variable between those two countries. And the agreement, a third-party agreement in the trading network is the independent independent variable. Now what they do is they take into account whether it actually matters. So if Mexico signs a trade agreement with the United States, that matters for the EU because competition is really high, right? But if Mali concludes an agreement with Burkina Faso, that doesn't really matter, right, for the EU because competition is really low. Because you don't trade much anyway, right? So you need to weight these other agreements in the network by the amount of competition that a country faces from these additional agreements, right? That's what they do. And they estimate the effect of a third-party agreement on the probability of an agreement in a dyad using a so-called duration model, which simply models the time until we see an agreement in this country pair. So this is the result. I'm going to explain this to you. So this is the so-called survival rate. It's a bit the same like in medicine. So you give somebody a treatment and you look how long it takes until this person feels better or not, right? And here the treatment is a preferential trade agreement in that network. So this is the so this line and these lines are the probability whether we see a year after this other agreement without an additional trade agreement, right? And this is for if the foreign preferential trade agreement doesn't produce doesn't produce competition. So if trade and competition is at the minimum, we see that the probability of an agreement does not, without an agreement, does not change. But if that other trade agreement produces a lot of competition, we see that the probability of having no agreement next year and in the second year after this agreement and then third year massively decreases. So in other words, if we see an agreement somewhere else in the network and that agreement produces a lot of competition, the likelihood of an agreement within this country pair increases massively, right? The probability of having another year without an agreement decreases. That's what this second line shows you, okay? And this effect is pretty strong. So what this shows you is that domino theory actually explains a lot many of the preferential trade agreements that we see in the international system. Good, let's take the break here. Let's take a 15-minute break, come back at 11:20, and then we're going to move into preferential trade agreements and development. let's move on, please. So, what I told you up to now basically applies to mostly to preferential trade agreements between northern countries and partially between northern countries and emerging markets. But many of these trade agreements are between industrialized countries, northern countries, and developing countries. And here the development strategy is crucial. And we're going to talk more about this in the next session in 2 weeks when we talk about development and trade. But the important thing to note here is that there was a major shift in the development strategy in the 1980s from what's called import substitution to export orientation. So in the 1970s, countries, especially South American countries, were trying to substitute imports. So they were trying to trade less and to develop in that way. And we saw a shift towards free trade in the 1990s, partially enforced by the international institutions like the IMF. And with this new development strategy, a key component was the competition for foreign direct investment. What is foreign direct investment? So this is investment into fixed assets. So those are assets that you cannot remove from the country at any, once you invest it, right? You build a factory, you build a plant to produce cars. So once you've done that, you cannot just remove that investment into another country. Well, you can, but it takes a lot of time and it's actually very costly. So there's competition for foreign direct investment, which is part of this development strategy, and preferential trade agreements are actually crucial for this. The problem here is that those countries now have a history of economic instability. So investment is politically faces a lot of political risks. And so changes in governments and therefore reversal and change of policy. And there's a so-called, what's called a time consistency, or sometimes it's called the time inconsistency problem. So the time consistency problem means that if you're a government of Brazil, you actually promise this a firm that you're not going to expropriate this firm before it invests. And you actually mean it because you really want this firm to come. But this promise is not credible because the firm understands that once they invested, you have an incentive to not stand up to this promise because it might be better off to actually now expropriate you or impose some regulation, right? So even if you mean it before, once that investment has been done, you have an incentive to cheat. That's the time inconsistency problem. So your incentives change over time. And the solution here is that you form an international agreement that solves this time consistency problem. You lock in a policy and you increase the cost. You tie your hands. That's how it's called. You increase the cost of changing this policy ex post. So your promise now is more credible because the firm understands that you have a high cost of cheating and changing a policy once they invested in your country. So here's an example of such a shift in the development strategy. So Mexico faced a debt crisis in 1982, and it was partially linked to this strategy of import substitution. It faced a debt crisis because the Mexican government was accumulating a lot of debt from foreign investors, and they could not repay it. So this was in August 1982 when the Mexican finance minister said, we're not going to repay our debt. Then they changed their development strategy, entered the GATT in 1986, and one purpose of NAFTA, one reason why Mexico joined NAFTA was to lock in these market-oriented reforms that came with the new development strategy. We see a similar development in Thailand, for instance. So we have a crisis. We have financial crisis in 1997. And afterwards, they started to change their development strategy, again, going back more on industrialization and signed preferential trade agreements with a number of developed countries. So more generally, this explains why preferential trade agreements go beyond just tariffs and direct issues that are directly related to trade. So we have political risks, and one is expropriation. And the solution is to include a clause to protect property rights in these preferential trade agreements. So this then, essentially, this is about investment and not about trade, right? Another problem is regulatory taking, which are simply regulations that limit the use of your private property. For instance, through regulations of employment of locals, local content quota, and so on. So again, you include clauses to protect property rights to avoid that in this preferential trade agreement. Another problem is that you might face economic instability in your host country. So this is all about big firms, multinational corporations who want to invest somewhere. So Nestle or Volkswagen or General Electric, whatever. They want to build a plant somewhere. And so by signing a preferential trade agreement, you actually give your home country, so the country where the multinational firms comes from, an interest in the host country. That's where you want to build a plant. And another problem, so that's now more directly related to trade. So why would a big firm want to build a plant there? Well, they want to produce cars in Brazil and sell them all over the world. Now that means that to produce those cars, they might have to import some inputs into Brazil. And the risk is that Brazil is now imposing trade barriers, right? So you're locking a zero tariff in the host country in Brazil. But the second risk is that your home country suddenly increases tariffs on those cars that you now want to export from Brazil to Germany or to the United States, right? So that risk is actually fairly real. That's what President Trump proposed to do, that he imposes tariffs on those goods that were produced by American firms but outside the US. So another purpose of these PTA is actually to lock in zero tariffs in the home country, in this case the United States. So now we know why governments would want to sign them. Now the question is, when do they sign them and what is the effect? And what's the politics behind this? And one reason is that it actually gives more credibility to economic reforms, and it actually induces economic reforms in the host countries. This is a paper by Bacchini and Opelainen, and that's the required reading for today. So we're going to discuss this in the tutorial. The question is, when do leaders sign international agreements? And they say they sign it especially when we have a new leader. So suppose we have a country that's democratizing. Take South Africa, for instance. South Africa in the mid-1990s was democratizing, and we have a new leader. So Nelson Mandela comes in as a new leader. Now that new leader faces a challenge, which is they now need to provide public goods. So goods that are good for, they need to provide benefits for everybody, because they depend on elections, right? But this requires economic reform. And economic reform is difficult because those who benefited from the old system, and they are pretty powerful groups, so in Australia, in South Africa, for instance, the white minority, they oppose these reforms, right? So this new leader wants a reform, wants to liberalize the economy, but he cannot overcome the domestic opposition. And the preferential trade agreement here helps, because to some extent it offers some compensation to those who oppose the reform, So in this case, the white minority in South Africa. And it actually gives more credibility to those reforms because they cannot be reversed as easily as before. So if we want to summarize Baccini and Opelainen in very simple terms, what is the dependent variable here? What's the causal mechanism, the story that they're telling? Well, they say if there's a new leader, there will be a preferential, it's more likely to have a preferential trade agreement. So now the preferential trade agreement is a dependent variable, and the new leader is the independent variable. But they go one step further. They say once we have a preferential trade agreement, it's more likely that we see economic reform. So now the dependent variable is the economic reform, and the independent variable is the preferential trade agreement. It's a causal mechanism, actually. A leader leads to a PTA, and the PTA leads to reform, right? That's what we saw in South Africa. So Nelson Mandela came into office in 1994, and he immediately started to negotiate a free trade agreement with the European Union that was concluded in 1999 with the purpose to actually offer compensation to those who lose from reform and to lock in these reforms. And to show you how they actually lock in these reforms, I took these graphs from Baccini and Opelainen, and what you see here is, so those vertical lines is when you start negotiations of a preferential trade agreement here between the EU and Algeria, between the EU and Poland, between the US and Jordan, between the United States and El Salvador. And the second vertical line is when this preferential trade agreement was concluded, when it was signed. Yes? So those are people those are groups that run the economy. They run firms, right? So what you do is you assume they are at least partially competitive, and you open up new markets for them. So they can benefit from selling their products abroad, which compensates them for the losses that they have at home. That's the basic idea. And what you see here is, so this is intellectual property right legislation, and the higher value means that you have more liberal, you have a reform. And what you see here is that with each of those agreements, we saw a big shift in this in legislation. We see major reforms. That's the first thing. And the second point is that they are not being reversed. We see reform. What we often see is a reform that is being taken back a few weeks later. But here it's actually persistent. We don't change it back. So we're going to talk more about this in the tutorial. Now the question is, we do all that. The idea is that it actually pays off, right? It pays off in terms of reducing political risk and therefore affecting the economy in positive ways. And as I said, one major component here is the competition for foreign direct investment, the competition for FDI. So if you want to examine whether PTAs actually are good for you, how would you do that? Which dependent variable would you pick? So you want to test whether preferential trade agreements reduce political risk, reduce the risk of expropriation, because it provides a commitment mechanism if you reform, and any domestic reform could be taken back at any point, but not if it's basically locked in by a preferential trade agreement. So what will you look at? Yes? So you look at foreign direct investment, and you look at whether foreign direct investment actually increases after you sign such an agreement, right? If this story is true that I'm telling you, what you should see is that after the signature of an agreement that has an investment clause, you should see more foreign direct investment flowing into that country. So that's what Bütte and Milner are doing. They look at the effect of preferential trade agreements on foreign direct investment flows. So they take all developing countries since 1971, and they look at whether foreign direct investment into these developing countries increases after certain types of preferential trade agreements. That's the key result here. So here, time 0 is the year when you sign a preferential trade agreement. So time 0 in South Africa would be 1999. That's when South Africa signed an agreement with the European Union. And you look at the average, what you see here is the average foreign direct investment flow into developing countries before, so 2 years before the agreement, 1 year before the agreement, in the year of the agreement, 1 year after, 2 years after, 3 years after. And they split these flows into 2 groups. The solid line are those who in time 0 sign a preferential trade agreement with investment clauses. And the dashed line is those countries that sign in time 0 a preferential trade agreement without an investment clause. And what we see is that those who sign one with an investment clause, they suddenly experience more foreign direct investment after the preferential trade agreement than those who sign one without an investment clause. So you could say this is evidence that signing such an agreement is actually beneficial for you if you want to attract foreign direct investment. But we could go even deeper. What's the causal mechanism here? Who takes the decision? How could you test that as well, this argument, by looking at a step that's happening here in between? We haven't talked about this. So what they look at the investment climate. So they directly look at, so that's Kenyon and Margalit. They directly look at the perception of firm leaders, firm executives, of countries that sign agreements or not. So does it help if you sign an agreement? Are you being evaluated more favorably by firms? That's what they ask. So do preferential trade agreements really influence investment decisions of firms? So all the story that I told you about FDI, that works through firms, right? Big multinational firms. So what they do is they send a survey to potential investors. So these are firms in Brazil, India, South Africa, and South Korea, so big firms in these countries. And they do interviews with the executives of these firms. And they use an experimental design. So they do different treatments. They tell the leader, or this executive, this firm leader, look, here's a country, and this country implemented some liberalization policies. They announce it and they implement it. Then another group of executives, they tell them, well, look, here's a country, and that country signed a preferential trade agreement. And then they go to a different group of executives and then tell them, look, here's a country. So specifically they say, like, country X is a developing country. It has a population of 8 million people and is considered politically stable. The country is a member of the World Trade Organization and has signed several bilateral trade treaties and preferential trade agreements. And then they ask, how would you rate the investment climate in this country? So 1 is very bad and 5 is very good. And now they look at how the different executives responded differently. So if that country, if you tell the executive the country didn't do anything, so the attractiveness of investment climate is about 2.75, right? But if in addition you tell them that they signed an international agreement, preferential trade agreement, the average response is that the investment climate is about 3.5, so way better, right? So this treatment, this telling the executive something about the preferential trade agreement, positively influences the assessment of the investment climate. If you just say something about domestic liberalization, it's good, but if you add an international agreement, the perception is way better. So I'm going to show you one last study, and then we're going to put all this together, actually. So I'm going to show you how you should read these kind of texts. So this is just a series of studies of the effect of preferential trade agreements. So I'm going to put this all together in a moment. So here's the last one. So we just learned that preferential trade agreements increase credibility of economic policy in a developing country. So how exactly does it work? How do investors learn about this, right? So how, and here, the study by Gray, she looks at transition countries, so emerging markets that have a credibility problem. So those transition economies are those that move from one political system to another, like Slovakia in the early 1990s, right? So they are democratizing, and now they have there's a lot of political risk, so what can they do? And what she says is that you can sign a preferential trade agreement with a credible actor, like the European Union, and the European Union tells something, so if the European Union is willing to sign an agreement with you, then this tells something to investors. It provides new information, because an investor has very little information about Slovakia, for instance, right? But the EU has a lot of information about Slovakia, because they carefully evaluate that country on an annual basis. So what they do is, they just look at what the EU does and infer from that whether Slovakia is actually doing well or not. And how can we measure that? What Gray does, she looks at the interest rate, so on government debt. So low interest rates mean you're highly credible. Think about Greece during the Eurozone crisis, right? I'm sure you heard about the increase of interest rates on Greece sovereign bond. And that's because there was a fear that the country destabilizes and does not pay back its debt. So the takeaway point here is a high interest rate means low credibility, a low interest rate means high credibility. So here's the result on Slovakia. So Slovakia had an autocratic regime in the 1990s until 1997, and this regime was replaced by a new government, a new democratically elected government in 1998. So this is from 1996 to 1998. So here interest rates increase over 25%. And then the new government comes in, it starts to implement economic reforms immediately, but the interest rate remains high. So it's actually not credible what they're doing. Nobody pays attention. Now they apply to access the European Union. And in 2000, the EU announces that they take up negotiations with Slovakia. And just by this announcement, what we see is that the interest rate actually massively drops. So the credibility of that country massively increases. So just the fact that the EU says, yes, we will have negotiations, they haven't concluded anything yet, tells a lot to investors that the EU is actually confident that Slovakia is on the right track. The reforms happened already before that, the reforms that Slovakia implemented. So also note that this story is actually consistent with what I told you about Bacini and Orpelein. And Bacini and Orpelein said, when a new leader comes in, we are more likely to see a preferential trade agreement. That's exactly what happened here, right? In 1998, we have a new government, and they start to negotiate an agreement with the EU immediately. And with each new information about EU accession, we see a drop in the interest rate, which means more credibility. So Slovakia is able to signal credibility to investors by signing international agreements. So international politics has strong economic effects here. Okay, so I showed you a series of studies. What I want to show you now is how you should read them and how you should put them together. And you can really simplify everything a lot that you read in these studies to get a one clear picture. So there's a bigger picture here. Just a second. Okay. So let's start with Pacini-Opelainen, right? What was the dependent variable in Pacini-Opelainen? Now I'm trying to help to understand why I'm insisting so much on dependent variable, independent variables. It's all about putting these things together and simplifying. So what was the dependent variable in Pacini-Opelainen? Come on. What was it? Yes. So in one part it was the preferential trade agreement. So we have a PTA. And we want to explain this PTA with something. Just a second. I'm trying to make this. Can you read this? PTA. How do we explain this PTA? What's the independent variable? Yes. New leader and democratization, right? So we have democratization and a new leader. Okay? There was a second dependent variable in Pacini-Opelainen. What does the PTA do? So new leader leads to PTA, and the PTA leads to what? Yes? It leads to reform, exactly. So it's easier to do reform if we have a PTA. So this is Pacini-Opelainen. Right? How could we add the story by Gray and Slovakia to this picture? So this is Pacini-Opelainen in 4 words, right? How do we add Gray to this? She says something about the PTA, so an agreement with the EU, but you had reform in Slovakia, but it didn't help, right? It increased credibility a bit, but not much. It's all about credibility, right? So, you have a preferential trade agreement. It's about credibility. So, or political risk. And what she has, a different causal mechanism here. So we have here, we have the preferential trade agreement gives us a public signal. By the EU. Or if you sign one with the US, it's by the US, right? So this reduces uncertainty. Which increases credibility, right? So this is Gray. So you see here that Gray is directly related to what we talked about with Pacini and Opelainen, right? So you put those two studies together into a bigger picture. That's what we're doing here, right? How can we add Kenyon and Margalit about investment climate? Where would you add them? What was the dependent variable? Well, it was investment climate. How does it fit into this picture here? Where would you add them? Would you add them here? Would you add them here? Would you add them here? where you just, if you have a PTA, this means this leads to a better, so this leads to reform, this leads to more credibility, this leads to better evaluation by firm leaders, right? So this is the evaluation of a country by firm executives. So if you have a PTA, credibility increases, especially if you get a signal from the EU that it's all fine, and that leads to better evaluation by firm executives. So this is Kenyon and Margalit. So how do we add Bütter and Milner? What's the dependent variable in Bütter and Milner? Yeah. And where do we put it? Exactly. So this just, the better evaluation by executives leads to more foreign direct investment. So this is here, right? So PTA with an investment clause leads to more FDI. Okay? So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 studies that seem independent, right? But they actually all speak to the same big question. Why do we have PTAs? Why do we see the sudden explosion of preferential trade agreements? And what's their effect, politically and economically? So this is how you should read these papers. You have a big picture, so this is the big picture. And each study speaks to a part of this big picture, right? By picking different dependent and independent variables. But once we put them together, we have a clear causal mechanism that's behind that they present. So that's one way to read these things, these studies. And that's why I'm insisting so much on dependent variable, independent variable, causal chain, causal mechanism, blah, blah, blah. It's because it helps you to extract the essential information from each paper and put it together to get the big picture, right? That's what this is all about. Causal mechanisms are important because most political arguments or economic arguments, they just assume a certain kind of political causal mechanism, right? So we need to understand them. We need to we need to expose them and look at them carefully by evaluating them step by step. That's the purpose of all this. Any questions? Good. So next week we will have the reading week, so we can digest all this, and then the week after we're gonna connect directly to this by talking about trade and development. See you then.